Now, it's with pleasure that looking through the slides today, I see that they're going to be very similar. You're going to hear from 3 different people, but the themes are in common. And I've constructed my slides in response to the request that I received from you and arbitrarily divided it into 2 halves, writing this morning and publication after lunch. But I think the real message to take away from today is the seamlessness, that actually from the inception of the research idea through to the published paper, it should be seen as a contiguous journey, not in discrete steps. So, we begin with writing for publication, and I'd be grateful if someone in the back could raise their hand if they can hear me. Thank you. Okay. And if I'm unclear at any time, please wave your hand about. So the aims this morning are to embed writing within a research strategy, to show how to design an answerable question, to flag ethical considerations, give a section-by-section guide to writing, very briefly, and to emphasize the importance and simplicity of a strong abstract. So by the end of this session, you'll be able to think about writing when you design a research question, phrase questions in an answerable format, prepare for ethical aspects of research, write a coherent research paper, and construct a convincing abstract. I think a really important message to begin with is that how you organize and undertake your study is actually more important than the words you use to describe it. I'm so pleased that you began today by hearing from a statistician, because that is integral to design, to helping you clearly define your clinical question. Perhaps to consult with trialists. Definitely involve a statistician. Make contact with your local institutional review board and have a look at what are called the ICMJE, that's the International Committee of Medical Journal Editor Guidelines, for items such as trial registration that you may need to fulfill before you start recruiting patients. And in fact, if one looks at the ICMJE website, a number of the topics that people have asked to be discussed today, like authorship, copyright, and preparing a submission, are detailed there in full in a document which used to be called the Uniform Requirements and is now Recommendations for Conduct, Reporting and Editing of Manuscripts. So the time to think about submitting your research is when you first plan that research. Why? Well, because you'll need to get a publication strategy in the protocol. You'll need to design your research to include the reporting requirements of reporting guidelines. And when you conduct the research, it's really important to concentrate on publishable data. Because if you don't incorporate the reporting requirements when you design your research, you'll come to write up your manuscript and there'll be whole sections that you cannot include. If you don't focus on publishable data right from the start, then your data will be far more difficult to interpret and far less convincing. It's also a time to think about authorship and to review the criteria for authorship. And I don't want to belabor this point at a time when it is in the front of the consciousness in Taiwan. But authorship has very strict definitions. And when those definitions are ignored, people get into trouble. Involve your sponsors as you develop the publication strategy. First of all, make sure that you have guaranteed autonomy to publish. Otherwise, you might find that you spend years of your life on a research project, but the publication is vetoed because the outcomes are undesirable to the sponsor. Ask the sponsor where would they like to see the manuscript published, and many sponsors can help you fulfill that aim, whether these are sponsors from charities, from medical societies, or the like. They will have experience in publication. They may have people who can advise you. And when you produce your funding proposal, you may want to consider journal fees depending on what type of publication model you select. And we'll discuss those publication models later. Also be aware that all the work that you've done in preparation for your research study can also be part of your research strategy. By that I mean your literature review you may wish to publish as a review article. Perhaps you've undertaken a systematic review, which will be expected now by many funders in order to get a very clear idea of the gaps of knowledge and to have a clear idea of what effect size you should be powering your study to detect. So that systematic review is something that you could also publish. You can publish protocols now, and indeed that's a very good way of planting your flag, marking out the territory as a place where you're undertaking research. So all this preparation is important because a well-prepared submission is actually going to take you time. Time invested in planning will pay back ample dividends when you come to write your research. Because there are opportunity costs. If you're having trouble getting an article published, then the time you spend resubmitting and rewriting that is time that could have been spent doing other things. Time that could have been spent moving your research forward into your next project, time that could have been spent with your family, time that could have been spent on leisure. There are also goodwill costs, particularly if you're doing research as part of a PhD project. The more you need to revisit territory, the more you find that contacting the same people for assistance may wear their patience. There's also the problem that your data becomes stale. Data ages very quickly, and beware that in many areas of exciting research you will have competition. And while you may be struggling in revising your draft, someone else may be submitting the very same research question to another journal. So all of this points to an efficient process where planning can make all the difference. How well you design your research affects all aspects of the study, not only the conduct, but also the acceptance for publication. So what is the key for publication? You heard in the last talk about reasons for acceptance and rejection. It is not all about small p-values. It's about asking the right question, in the right population, in the right way, at the right time. And this morning we're going to talk about formulating that question. But answering it in the right way is why you need to involve statisticians and people with methodological expertise. And answering it in the right time is the mark of true genius in research. It's looking at your field today and identifying the research question that's going to be important in 3 years' time and starting to plan for that now. At The Lancet, we're a clinical journal, so first and foremost, we're looking at clinical importance. We also want novelty. We're looking at research that's going to change practice, change thinking. But the presentation has to be clear, and moreover, it needs to be accurate. And then you need to make your submission compelling. And this we'll discuss within the context of how to write a convincing cover letter. Then it's submitting to the most important journal, the highest quality journal that can get to the audience where your research can have an impact. So what are common problems that follow from that? Well, in the manuscripts that we reject, very often the question just isn't clearly defined. And it's like setting out on a journey without a clear destination. It's hard to know when you've arrived, and often manuscripts read like that. Sometimes the outcomes chosen are not meaningful for clinicians, for patients, for policymakers. Sometimes the methods aren't appropriate. Trying to use, for instance, a retrospective or cross-sectional study to answer a question that really warrants a randomized trial, for instance. Sometimes the sample size is inadequate. It's just too small to draw a meaningful conclusion. So, how do you formulate a clear research question? It should be specific, measurable, answerable, relevant, and have a time scale to it. You put these together, and these are what we'd call SMART objectives. And one way to do that, for those of you who may be familiar with evidence-based medicine, is the PICO format, where PICO stands for population, intervention, comparator, if you use one, and outcome. And it's estimated that in outpatients, you'll probably be generating about 3 PICO questions in every outpatient department. Things that would have been useful to know to inform a clinical decision. And the way to think about it is the population. You can define this by age, by gender, by comorbidity. What kind of patients, what kind of population? And what's the intervention that you're looking at? Is it a diagnostic test? Is it a treatment? Perhaps it's a question of, were they exposed to something? For a comparator, you may wish to have a trial, a randomized trial with a placebo or against the current gold standard, or in some clinical questions there is no comparator. And then of course, what is the outcome? Now for the patient in front of you, the outcome might be symptoms. For yourself, you might be worried about the outcome of complications. For a policymaker, it could be an outcome of survival. So all different ways in which outcome can be measured. And it's refining the question so that it's as accurate and specific as possible. Now, of course, there can be sub-questions that embrace different outcomes. But it's that primary research question in a PICO format actually provides a format that can then be answered. It also provides a searchable format. And over the past few years, there has been enormous emphasis on reducing research waste. Waste is rather a terrible emotive term, but so much research that we see at the Lancet actually is not advancing scientific understanding, because that work has been done before. It's a question that's been answered, or the methodology is such that it doesn't contribute meaningfully to the totality of knowledge. So there's the reward campaign, which many universities have signed up to. So essentially, it's getting the right research priorities, it's using the right design, conduct, and analysis, is making sure that regulation and management of the research are proportionate to risks, not too oppressive, that all of the information on the research methods and findings are accessible, such as publishing protocols, and making sure that the reports are complete and they can be used. So the research design will follow from the research question, because that question will be phrased in such a way that it then becomes fairly clear what kind of design would lead on from that. Whether actually this is a research question that you've seen conflicting evidence on, so a systematic review might provide the answer, whether this is a research question that needs a cohort study, or whether it's an intervention that needs a randomized trial. That research question will define the population, it'll define your intervention, it will define your outcome, and then the types of analysis that are appropriate for it. So all of this is embedded within that research question, which makes the research question so integral to the success and eventual publication of the paper. Finally, because the design depends on the research, so the write-up will depend on that design. And we'll discuss later that there are different ways of writing up different types of studies. Now, ethics are very important and is something that medical journal editors consider. And in fact, we've been known to reject papers which have been passed through local ethics committees if we believe the conduct to not be ethical. Excuse me. I think we can broadly summarize ethics under the heading of duty of care. And just as you'll be very familiar on a daily basis with your duty of care to patients, so there is a duty of care to research participants. So I think start by looking at your own institutional review board or ethics committee to get approval. It may need to be broader than your local committee if you have a multi-site study. But it's excellent to make contact early on, so you learn what their requirements are and also what their dates are. Some committees will only meet every 3 months, and so it's important to make submission deadlines or your research may be delayed. Find out whether you need approval by any other institutions that are involved. And the process takes time, so it's something to be done early rather than waiting until you've planned all of your research and then you realize, oops, I need an ethics committee approval. Having said that, in some cases it may not be necessary, and we'll go through an example of that this morning. So there again, if you find out early, it's something that you can tick off your list. After the Institutional Review Board, think about informed consent. Again, not necessary for all types of studies, but necessary for many, and informed consent can be challenging in certain situations, for instance, in acute care. And this needs perhaps more careful consideration than it has been given in the past. And of note are the new NIH guidelines that are looking at trying to streamline informed consent. Beware of confidentiality to research participants, just as you would to your patients in the clinic. So as an example, I wanted to get a paper from Taiwan, which was on oncology. Here's one which was published in the Lancet Oncology a few weeks ago. So I don't know, are there any authors in this room? I'm sure you recognize them as colleagues. This comes from the absolutely splendid resource of the Taiwan National Insurance Database, something that we've published on before in the Lancet. And here we have a very simple statement. which relates directly to duty of care. It says that protect privacy. The NHRID encrypts the patient's personal information and provides the researchers with anonymous identification numbers. So therefore, patient consent was not needed, and the study was approved by the ethical committee. So very simple statement, absolute transparency. As an editor, when I read that, I feel satisfied that this paper has met obligations for duty of care to the participants, as would reviewers and readers. Another part of duty of care is doing what you say you're going to do, so following the protocol. So this is another reason why it's so valuable to have a protocol for any type of research study, and to make that protocol available in the public domain for people to follow. And indeed, most large research enterprises will post protocols on the website. It's also looking at adverse events in research, because all reporting guidelines are going to ask you to comment on adverse events. So you need to design that before you begin. You need to have a method for capturing adverse events, and ideally an active method rather than just one that's passive and waits for them to be reported. And beware that from 2018, data from randomized controlled trials will need a statement about data sharing, whether or not you intend to share your data, and if you do, under what circumstances. Similarly, for those of you doing genetics work, you'll want to think about Miami or other reporting guidelines, different websites, and how you want to deposit that genetic data for data sharing and to what extent. Authorship. I think authorship is important, both for competing interests, which we'll come to for a moment, for the responsibility of authors, and for the competing interests that they might affect the interpretation of the paper. So who is an author? I think essentially it's someone who's made substantial contributions to the conception, design, acquisition of data, analysis or interpretation of that data. It is not up to editors to decide who authors are. And about every 6 months at one of our journals there'll be an authorship dispute, and as editors we follow the Committee on Publishing Guidelines, COPE. So we will say to the authors, this is up to you to resolve. If authors cannot resolve disputes amongst authorships, it is then referred to the hosting or sponsoring institution to resolve. But this is very much up to you as authors to determine who is an author. But it's really important to think about the criteria for authorship in doing so. Perhaps it could be someone who comes on late, who's either drafted the article after the research is done or revised it critically for important intellectual content. But the warning for those people who come in that role is that they need to still take responsibility for every part of the research. Statisticians who may just be involved in an analysis have to convince themselves that actually this is properly done ethical research and the figures are correct. Authors should also be involved in the final approval of the version that's going to be published. A few years ago, The Lancet took it one step further, and we feel that an author is someone who has to be prepared to take personal responsibility and stake his or her reputation on the integrity of the research. Now that's a pretty serious commitment. So for those people who are department heads, who are very busy, it's important to appreciate the totality of that commitment when lending one's name to a publication. Statements of interest. Our definition at The Lancet is that a statement of interest exists when an author or the author's institution has a financial or personal relationship with other people or organizations that can inappropriately influence actions. So this goes beyond a mere financial stake. I think statements of interest can also involve sponsorship. So therefore, one would expect to see at the end of a methods section a statement like this on the role of the funding source that says what role the funders had with the design, data collection, or analysis. In this case, there was none. And here the corresponding author is stating explicitly that she or he had full access to the data in the study and had the final responsibility for the decision to submit that data. So it's moving authorship from a passive role to an active role. And again, at the end of a manuscript, to further clarify the role of each author, what did each person do? So some people thought of the concept and designed the study, other people provided materials for the study, but all of them together collected, analyzed, interpreted, wrote, and improved the paper. So think carefully about authorship as you're designing your research project. Who is going to bring value to your paper through their intellectual contributions? Well, writing a paper is like telling a story. It's something that we all do in other forms every day. So try to think of this as a research story. And each section of the paper has a purpose within that story. And to move from section to section, you're going to want to keep the paper flowing in a logical manner. Now, reporting guidelines are there for just that purpose, to help you do so, because they make sure that all the necessary details are included and in a logical order. And if I say reporting guidelines, can anyone in the room shout out the name of a reporting guideline so we all understand what we're talking about? Has anyone used a reporting guideline in this room? I'm sure you have. Thank you. Please stand up. What guideline have you used? I should bring the microphone to you. This is the midpoint where we get everyone moving about a bit.
I'm not sure the correct name of the guideline, but I guess it's called ethical.
And what guideline was that for?
That's a guideline for reporting research about database or database mining.
Terrific. Thank you. Any other guidelines that people have used? Has anyone done a randomized controlled trial here? Okay, if I said strobe, could anyone tell me what that's a guideline for?
I think there's a stroke guideline, NIHSS.
Treatment guidelines. Okay. So reporting guidelines, things like CONSORT, the Consolidated Standards for Reporting of Trials, for randomized trials, PRISMA, the Principles for Reporting of Meta-Analysis and Systematic Reviews. So these are guidelines that have been put together by researchers, by statisticians, methodologists, and editors to aid reporting. And so I'll put an example up and we can go through that. And in any story, as you tell it, you want to keep your audience in mind. You want to keep your reader in mind. So that brings us to the next question. Who is your reader? And as you're thinking about that research question, who needs the answer to that research question? Who are you answering it for? Who do you want to reach? So your audience influences not only the choice of journal that you will choose, but your style of writing, the design of your research. So you need to define your readers, if possible, when you're actually planning your protocol. So what does your reader know? Do not overestimate their background experience, but at the same time, don't underestimate their intelligence. Remember that editors and reviewers are also going to be readers. So they may not have highly detailed knowledge of what you're talking about, but they will need clear descriptions to draw inferences to help them understand. So try to think of your reader. Have a mental image. Imagine them sitting in your office while you're at your computer writing your paper, sitting in a chair. And think that you're not talking to your computer, but you're talking to them, and you're telling them your research story. And if we look at a manuscript, there is an anatomy to it. An introduction, a method section, a results section, and discussion, commonly referred to as the IMRAD format. I think if there's an anatomy, one can also think of a physiology, that a manuscript should have a unidirectional flow. You want to have logical arguments and transitions from one section to the other. So a common error, for instance, is results are introduced in the discussion. And then think of the psychology of the manuscript. The more you know your reader, the more you will be able to write accordingly, to get inside their head. You'll know to offer enough stimulation to keep the reader with you, so that the introduction is logically going to lead to your research question. And as we said earlier, the question will lead to a specific design, and the results to the discussion. So try to avoid jumping about. And this all begins with the title. So a descriptive title. So many titles we see are declamatory. X works in condition Y. Where actually a non-declamatory title is far better. And this should include the study design. So, for instance, it might be the association between polycystic kidney disease and renal cancer in Taiwan, a cohort study. Straightforward descriptive title. It's the same way in selling newspapers. Newspapers used to have a declamatory comment in front of the newsstand, which would say some team had won a championship. But now they're getting far more clever, and they will have a sign that says latest sports results inside. So they get you to come and actually read the paper to find out what's happening. It's the same way with research papers. A non-descriptive title, because very often a declamatory title may not be supported by the research. It may go beyond the research. Abstracts also follow the IMRAD format. and there is a consort study guide template that you can use for constructing an abstract. And a common error in abstracts is when you get to the interpretation, the sort of discussion type section at the end of the abstract, many people use this merely to repeat the results. But it's not a repetition of the results. It should be an interpretation of those results. And then, of course, funding at the end of the abstract, often left out. But that's important to include. So in constructing an abstract, it's important because some journals are going to make their decision based solely on your abstract. For others, it might be based on the abstract and the cover letter. So the abstract needs to be of high quality. I would suggest to you the rule of 5 hows. So how done? We follow the reporting guidelines. How many? Absolute numbers, not percentages. How much? With an effect size, confidence intervals, and p-values. How useful? This is your interpretation, your implications for practice and research. And then how funded. So let's go back to that paper and see how these 5 hows are used in the abstract. How was it done? So here we have a straightforward description of what was done. Easy to follow, a bit more detailed than you'll see in many abstracts, but nothing wrong with that. Does anyone remember what happens after how done? How many? And here we have the absolute numbers. We see right away from the abstract how many patients had polycystic kidney disease and the controls. So after how many, it's how much. And here there is the effect size. So we know what the follow-up is. We've got interquartile range. And here we go. We've got the ratio with confidence intervals and a unit of time. Now, it's really important to add some kind of qualification to your numbers in the abstract with something like a 95% confidence interval. So reading that, people have a very clear idea. And here there's also been the addition of p-values. So the how much is quite clear. Contrast this with sometimes one might find an abstract which talks merely about percentages, and so it becomes very hard to know whether that percentage is based on a handful of people or, as in a study like this, 4,000 people. Then how useful? So this tells us that it is the first report of this association. And then finally, how funded? A very simple statement there. There is nothing complicated about putting the abstract together. You've already done all the hard work. And so it's providing a focus template to take out that information which is going to be of greatest value to someone who's going to make a decision based on this abstract of whether or not to read your manuscript or send it out for peer review. So very lean abstracts. Remove the things that aren't essential, secondary endpoints and the like. The introduction of the paper. Generally quite brief, 2 or 3 paragraphs. One paragraph can be what is known, and then another paragraph, what needs to be known, and why it is important. Classically, the introduction should end with the research question. your PICO question. So you're actually drawing the reader into your world. You're saying, here's a problem, this is what we know, this is why it's important, this is what we need to find out, and here's how we're going to do it. And here we are at the end of the introduction. So this is a 4-paragraph introduction, and the summary is: little evidence is available to support the association. Therefore, we did a cohort study to establish the risk of cancer in patients with polycystic kidney disease without chronic kidney disease or end-stage renal disease. So there you've got your population and the outcome that's being looked for. Methods, next. Now, methods is the section that editors are going to read with the greatest detail. And the reason is, if the methods aren't sound, then the findings aren't reliable. So there's an opportunity here to link to your protocol, either if it's been published by citing it, if it's not been published, through an appendix or through an institutional web address where the protocol can be posted. The methods section should say upfront about ethics approval, registration. Registration isn't only for randomized controlled trials. It is required for randomized controlled trials, but it's available for any type of research. In fact, there's a dedicated database, Prospero, for registration of systematic reviews, but observational research, any type of research, can be registered. And if it is registered, that sends a valuable message that actually this was a prospective study and you set out with a specific research question in mind. The methods section is also where to mention informed consent. So essentially, methods are who, that's the patient population, where, their location, not only geographically, but also within the health system. Are you talking about a tertiary care hospital? Are you talking about primary care? Are you talking about community centers? What you did and how you did it. So the big question is, how much detail is enough? For non-medicinal interventions, a systematic review in Cochrane showed that it's very, very difficult to replicate because there's hardly ever enough detail for replication. So if it's a medicinal pharmacological intervention, then one would hope the methods would have enough to allow someone else to replicate your study. For non-pharmacological interventions, then you'll probably need to submit an appendix which has more details of what you did, rather than extend the methods section to being too long. Because when you write the methods section, bear in mind what the journal requirements are for word length. If a power calculation is involved, then the methods section will include that under the statistical analysis part. So often we see power calculations that are absolutely fanciful. There is very little that we do in healthcare that has more than a 20, perhaps 30% benefit. And therefore, to see a power calculation premised on the fact of a halving of an outcome is not logical. And right away, it rings alarm bells. And it says someone's trying to get away with a smaller sample size, or else with a highly composite endpoint, which may be difficult to interpret. So if you need to use a power calculation, it's important that it is as accurate as possible. And then in the methods section, as we saw earlier, a statement at the end about the role of the funder. results after methods, beginning with the exact dates. So often people omit the dates when they're talking about the results. The demographics of your populations, and then your findings. And with the findings, a plea. Please don't put the finding that is of greater statistical significance first, but the results should be ordered in the same way that you set up the research question. So your primary outcomes first, followed by your secondary outcomes. If you have outcomes which are not reported, it's very important that you list those outcomes and saying the following were also studied and will be reported elsewhere. Just so that there is transparency and that readers can follow and understand if there is going to be a subsequent report and where else to look for information about your study. Publishers are trying to make this easier by introducing something called Crossmark, where we will have threaded publications and be able to link all studies related to a single protocol. So whether one might be in an economics journal, one in a health affairs journal, one in a basic science journal, to make it easier to piece together the totality of evidence. For all the results, important that they have an effect size with quantification. For p-values, I would encourage you to use the exact p-values from the outset. Some journals will wish to abbreviate p-values as being less than, say, 0.05, 0.01, 0.001. Other journals will want exact p-values. But if you start off in the initial manuscript by using exact p-values, it's a lot easier to convert that through a rounding exercise to p less than 0.01 than it is to re-estimate a p-value that you've recorded as less than 0.01 to the exact p-value should the journal require it. So it's just, again, saves you time in the long run. Post hoc analyses, people do post hoc analyses. There's nothing inherent, it's acceptable to do post hoc analysis. I'm not a fan of post hoc analyses, but we will publish a post hoc analysis if it adds to the study, but it needs to be absolutely transparent. This is a post hoc analysis that was not part of the design and has not been powered. Then the discussion. So start here with a summary of your findings, the strength of your paper. Now, what were the good things about your research? Why is it an important contribution? What's the context that your research is taking place in? Because, of course, that will have changed since you designed your research question. Science will have moved on in the intervening months. What is the added understanding that your findings bring within that new context? And of course, limitations. And here, be honest. All research has limitations. We're not asking for you to beat yourself up about the limitations, but to share them with the readers so that they can interpret your paper, as we say, warts and all. And then finally, what are the implications for clinical practice, for health policy, perhaps for future research as well? It can be a good way to plug your next research project. And then at the end of the text, the contributor section, who did what, your statement of interest for each author, and the acknowledgements. Now, journals will each have specific guidelines. For the ICMJE journal members, these will be reflections of the main parent document. But for instance, at The Lancet, you'll find 7 pages of author guidelines. So it's important to look through these before you submit. And also to look at reporting guidelines. So inadequate reporting hampers interpretation. Essentially, good reporting minimizes bias. And as editors, we're trying to use the revision and editorial process to minimize bias. Reporting guidelines increase transparency, reduce bias, and all reporting guidelines can be found on this website here called the Equator Network website. It's one that I strongly recommend you visit and have a look at before doing your next research project, and certainly when writing up a paper. And those of you who are advisors to PhDs, it's important to look at this to make sure that PhD projects, other projects within your department, are written according to these guidelines. The cohort study is an example of an observational study. So that would follow the Strobe guidelines. So these are for observational studies, and they have subsections for each different type of observational study. Now, many guidelines are present on the website in translations in several languages. This includes Strobe, which has a Chinese translation, and although I apologize for the clarity of the slide, but you can see it's a line-by-line guide. What should be stated in each section. And so with that by your side, it's a bit like a cookbook to make sure that you get all the ingredients put in and put in the right quantity and order as you're writing. And for people who haven't written lots of manuscripts, it's a very comforting companion to just walk through the main steps and help you produce a manuscript that has all the essential elements in it that you need. The sorts of elements which, had you left them out, might cause editors or reviewers to discount your research, to assume that you hadn't done them rather than neglected to add them. So that's why it's so important. So another thing with manuscripts, of course, are the non-text items. By this we mean figures, tables, panels. How many should you have? What should you put in them? Well, I think they're there to add clarity to your story. The same way when you're telling another story, you might reach for your phone to show a snapshot. So they won't be necessary for every part of the story, but they can help with some. I think a key rule is don't duplicate the findings in the text. So either findings are in the text or they're in the non-text item, except for your headline findings. No one wants to read the same thing twice. You then may have an issue of what goes in the text and what goes in the appendix. And nowadays with electronic publication, you can put an enormous amount of material in the appendix. Lots of analyses that you've done, and keep the text relatively lean and easy to navigate. Here I'd be guided by the journal and by the reporting guidelines. If something is in the reporting guideline, it should be in the text. Keep the reader in mind as well. For you, many of these sub-analyses are fascinating, but what does the reader need to know? Figures are there to give a quick visualization of your concept. So they can have a dramatic effect. They're useful particularly for trends in a graph. If you do use figures, please don't truncate scales, particularly on a Kaplan-Meier plot. Don't truncate the axes. And if you're using Kaplan-Meier, then each time point should have the event rate for the populations underneath. In this paper, very nice, elegant, the simple flow chart, simple figure 1 that one would see in most research papers, and one can see at a glance how patients were apportioned into the study groups And you can follow that through to the numbers that were analyzed at the bottom and understand quite clearly how candidates moved from here on through the system to analysis. Tables, on the other hand, are good for emphasizing comparisons or changes between groups. And if you're using tables, then obviously be aware of having a mean, medians, and these two, like effect sizes, need to be quantified, whether it be a standard deviation or an interquartile range. In tables, it's important to avoid clutter. We see an awful lot of tables that go on for a page or over a page. So many of those, I would say, could be in an appendix. Try to get the key material within the table that goes in the text. And if you're doing a randomized controlled trial, certainly at the Lancet, we regard it as good statistical practice not to calculate p-values in your baseline characteristics table 1. If we see that, it begins to ring alarm bells about the conduct and the full understanding of the methods involved. And then for references, just beware that there is a difference whether you're writing for a clinical science or a social science journal. At the Lancet, it's the Vancouver style, which begins with an Arabic numeral for each reference. And I would say prioritize peer-reviewed journals in references. Wikipedia is generally not a strong reference to use. I know for some fast-breaking news-related research, you may wish to have a non-peer-reviewed news item. That's fine, but in general, try to go for peer-reviewed items. Try to go for more recent items in the references. The other thing about references is when you've written your paper, it's worth looking through them. Because generally speaking, the types of places that you went to for information and that you've cited may be the same places that your readers go to for information. And they may give you a good guide of where your manuscript might ultimately be published. It could reveal a journal that you hadn't really thought about submission to, but if you see that you're referring to it regularly, it's worth thinking, is that someplace I should submit? So with writing style, we keep coming back to this point. Keep your reader in mind. Use the active tense. It used to be that reading a research paper was very dull. Things were done in a passive sense. The test tube was placed in the centrifuge. We put the test tube in the centrifuge. It's getting we into the paper, talking about things you're doing, not things that were done to something else. Try to avoid jargon, because if you're writing for an international audience, jargon will have different meanings and may lose its context in different audiences. Again, think about your reader. Like jargon, abbreviations can also be a problem. So I would suggest you minimize abbreviations and define in full at the first use. Generally speaking, except for common abbreviations, we limit abbreviations to just one per research paper, and with the exception of HIV, we do not abbreviate diseases. When you're choosing words, try to use words that are precise rather than words that are vague, so that the interpretation of what you're trying to say won't be lost on readers who may not be native readers of your language. And I think relax. This is sharing a story. Try to enjoy it. Now, if you're writing in English, please be assured that quality journals are going to be more interested in your ideas than in your words. and avoid text recycling. It can be very tempting to be very impressed with the way somebody phrased an idea that you have and to borrow that person's idea. But any text that is used without attribution, without quotation marks and a direct reference would be regarded as text recycling, also known as plagiarism, and that's considered scientific misconduct and can cause all sorts of problems. Lots of journals use plagiarism detection software, so please be careful about that. If you really think it's a phrase you want to use, fine, but please keep it in quotation marks and reference the source. Otherwise, try to think of using your own words, because they often carry a ring of authenticity. And although at The Lancet we edit everything that we receive to a house style, more and more we try to lighten that editing to keep the voice of the author coming through. And if you're worried about the quality of your English writing, then a simple trick is to share it with a colleague in another department and see if they can read through your manuscript and understand what you're talking about, and if there are any points that they feel need a bit more explanation. So getting started. Well, as we said before, spend most time planning the research, thinking about it, and then writing. And I'm sure you'll all have tricks and habits that you find work for you. And I'd like to begin the brief question period after this by having you share what works for you when you're writing a paper. One thing that I picked up from Ernest Hemingway is when Hemingway was writing, he would write until he had his next idea, and then he would stop writing for the day. That way, when he came back the next day, he had an idea, and he could begin writing immediately to develop that idea, and that would take him through to the next idea with the momentum, and then he'd stop. If you have time, that's a luxurious way of doing it, if it works for you. It may help for people who have trouble looking at a blank page and coming up with that idea. So if you always come back to the document with an idea, it's one way that works for some people to keep writing. And enjoy what you're doing. This is not supposed to be a burden. So in summary, embed writing within the research strategy. Start with a novel, important, smart question. Incorporate ethical requirements in your plan. Follow the appropriate reporting guideline. Make the abstract full, clear, and faithful. Thank you.